Everybody, welcome to another episode of the show. Today we have Mike Baird, who is the CEO and founder of Accelerate Dental. They are effectively a dental private equity firm that rolls up dental practices, but does it in a unique way that's quite unheard of in the marketplace. So, but prior to that, Mike has experience with starting telehealth software and hardware companies, serving as CEO of top 50 companies in the country. Very well-versed, experienced executive and entrepreneurship experience. So it was a great story. We dive into the details on a lot of his experiences and structures and investments, and excited for everyone to hear Mike's story. With that, let's jump in. Okay, everyone, welcome to another episode. Today, do you prefer Mike or Michael? Mike. Okay, we've got Mike Baird, who serves as CEO and founder of Accelerate Dental, a next-gen dental partnership organization which empowers dentists to be the primary beneficiaries of the financial upside of their practices. Prior to that, Mike served as CEO of Henry Schein One. Henry Schein One? Henry Schein One, the world leader in dental practice management software. And prior to that, he was the founder and CEO of Avizia, and served as president of Amwell after Avizia was acquired in 2018. Mike holds a BS degree in accounting from BYU and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. So quite a bit of accomplishment there, Mike, and sure we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
So welcome in.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I am too. I'm excited to have you. I love to talk a little bit about people's upbringing. I find it very interesting to hear about childhood, teenage years, parents' influences that shaped you. Yeah, past trauma that helped to identify, who you are today.
Okay. Good childhood, good family, good siblings, all those things, right? But I would say it's interesting. There are a couple of themes that ended up tracking to, I think, my career. The first was my dad. I don't think he'd call himself an entrepreneur, but was mostly self-employed for almost at least the entire career where I was home. And most of those ventures failed over and over again. So I ended up moving like 15 times or something over the course of growing up, and all over the country, right? So started in Utah, Colorado, Georgia, California, lived in 5 different places in California, then moved back to Utah when I was a junior in high school. And so a great supportive family and all those things. But ironically, as an entrepreneur, I took away from that. I want stability and security. So I got an accounting degree, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s, I think I was around 35 when I started my first business. And so it was very different. I think I started much more with, I need stability. I'm going to check the box. So I'm going to get an accounting degree from a top school, and then I'm going to work for a blue chip company, and then I'm going to get an MBA. And anyway, but yeah,
that's so similar to, so my dad was a news anchor.
Oh,
and
awesome.
We were probably 8 different times, but by the time I was 16,
yeah.
Very unstable, a lot of job loss, ups and downs. Yeah. And so I studied accounting at BYU. I had the same exact mentality. Like, I don't want to be moving around. I'm going to get the best degree with the highest job placement.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's so similar. And then just a couple of years ago, I'm 32 now, but that's when it flipped for me. Like, you know what? I think I should try something on my own. So anyway, can resonate with that.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like going into school in BYU and accounting, you didn't have that necessarily, that entrepreneurial bug yet.
Yeah. In fact, if anything, I had the reverse bug.
Yeah.
Like, we need stability,
Yeah.
My wife's father worked at the same company for like 40 years and she lived in the same house from the time she was 3 until she graduated. And like, okay, we're going to be really stable. And, for me, I went and worked for Dell, after BYU, which was a great experience. This was right before the .com, bubble. And at the time, it was the number 1 company in the S&P 500 for 10 years. So I'm like, this couldn't be better, you know? And then I did an MBA from a top 5 school. And then I went and worked for McKinsey & Company. I mean, we're checking boxes here, right?
Absolutely.
And even after I left that, I started to go to some more entrepreneurial type companies, but, kind of billion in value or size and revenue. So still not really small, but eventually I think it does come back. And I actually credit my dad in many ways. And I look at his brothers and his family upbringing. I think they're all very entrepreneurial, not necessarily successful entrepreneurial, but that's part of the gig that starts to draw on you. I think you get used to, I guess the other thing I'd give from my childhood, I always joke like rules from the Baird household. And one of them was, it's a shame to fix, to pay anyone to do something that you could possibly do yourself. Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of a family of builders and tinkerers and, house projects and whatever it was. And so if you've got that mentality and, you're working through various big corporate America type things, eventually you get a little bit frustrated, and you want to try something different. And at least for me, I know I loved my time at McKinsey. I loved my time at Dell. It was great. But I definitely saw when I was at McKinsey and you're a consultant, and I was there 4 years, which is longer than I think most people end up lasting. You have this yearning to be on the operator side. And I had been an operator of sorts at Dell, really could tell that I was missing that because you have the good ideas, but you just want to get your hands dirty and make it happen. And after I left, and I spent about 5 years after I left McKinsey before I started a company. And, I was progressing through various roles, but you hit a point where I just want to do. I want to get my hands dirty. I want to take the risk. I want to do things. And so, for me, that was ultimately whatever it was. 2013 is when I spun out. So I was probably 36 or 37 at that point in time. I got a huge mortgage, in DC and 4 kids. It's like perfect time to start a job, start a new company. Let's take the risk. Yeah. Right. But it's funny how those trends drive us.
I mean, with thinking back now, would you have done anything differently, or was the experiences that you had at McKinsey and other groups pivotal to being able to do what you ultimately did?
That is such a hard question because I look at my kids, a few of whom have a real strong desire to be entrepreneurs. When you're listening to like how I built this podcast when you're like 10, you might want to think about being an entrepreneur. And yet there is definitely value from checking the boxes and getting experience. Whenever I've reflected on things like this, I think, wow, I had kind of deep periods of time where I did accounting and then a couple of years in marketing and then a few years in operations. And then I had time in pricing and strategy. And, you've checked a lot of these boxes so that when I felt like when we started our company, I remember the first time we went and pitched investors, we were doing like $7 million. And I thought that was not good. Would you ever considering investing? I'm going to like seed round investors. And they're like, you're doing how much revenue, Right. And so I do think it helped because I felt like we were very professional by the time we started and, had best practices to draw on because I had worked at, Dell, I'd worked at Cisco, I'd worked at some really premier companies and obviously all the wonderful companies I served when I was at McKinsey. There's a lot of polish there. On the flip side, as I feel like I'm getting older, you start to realize the value of time in entrepreneurship as well and how much you can learn those lessons really quickly. And so I guess I'm probably a bit of a hybrid approach. If I talk to my kids, I'd say, you got to do at least 5 years of something because you have to know why you do it. And I think part of what motivates me now, because, when you, especially, I started a second company recently when you do take risks. You don't have the secure salary. I took a huge pay cut when I started, this thing. But you got to remember, but I love that I own this and I'm making it happen and I'm the driver and I don't have some, boss or PE firm or something with a gun to my head. But if you haven't learned some of that, I'm afraid you don't have enough motivation to go through all the chaos of being a founder. So I'd be on the get a little bit of real world. And then once you're miserable in your corporate job, you have the motivation to jump as opposed to just jumping straight in. But, it can work either way. Yeah.
I love that. I love that insight, Mike. And I love that you were mid 30s when you did it. Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, have the misconception that it needs to be right out of college or even just skip college. You don't need it anymore. I mean, there's so much value to having that experience, having that track record, the network, the resume to be able to go out and I think you just start at a different plane than having doing, right out of college or what have you. So certainly pros and cons, but to your point, entrepreneurship takes time. I mean, we're 2 years into our venture and it's every day I'm like, I wish things were happening faster. I wish we could move quicker. I wish we could, but it does just take grinding and time. And so it's all in a balance.
I think what it does in a way is we probably made a less lucrative venture successful because of the professionalism that we brought to it, if that makes sense, versus if we had started straight out, you almost have to have a better idea to compensate for your lack of experience in some ways. And so maybe that's how it all works out in the end. And look, if you're young, you really just don't have the pressure. You don't have the mortgage. You don't have the kids. You can take a bunch of gambles, and maybe more at bats is better.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know that there's one right way to do it, but it is interesting to see how those experiences drive us.
Yeah, love it. So you go from McKinsey to Cisco, Tandberg. What was your role there, and how did that kind of help you pivot into when you started something like that?
So when I left McKinsey, I resigned the day after Lehman Brothers collapsed, which was a really like interesting time. And then Bear Stearns was going down, and there was all the bailouts, and it was like not a really good economy, but I was ready. I felt like I had learned. One of my pieces of advice to people is you got to stay long enough to learn. I think people tend to leave jobs too soon. But by that point, I'd been there 4 years. I felt like I knew what I wanted, and I really had a hunger to be in an operating role. And I ended up going to this company, Tandberg, which nobody's heard of, and it's since been acquired. So it's gone. But it was this awesome company. It was a Norwegian company. U.S. headquarters were in D.C. doing video conferencing. And but when I was looking for a job, I found this company, and like 10 of the top 12 people were ex-McKinsey. I'm like, what is going on at this company? And I ended up having an awesome experience. One, because it was neat tech. Video conferencing is pretty commonplace now, but in 2009, 2010, this was more novel. And it had an amazing culture, which definitely influenced a lot of my decisions later on as an entrepreneur. But then I was there about 18 months before we got acquired by Cisco, which was our biggest competitor at the time. And this was very much we were the leader in the space, but they were the giant, and they kind of swallowed us as an innovation play. And that was a weird thing to go back to, because we felt like a small company, and we were doing about 800 million in revenue, but had gotten there relatively quickly. I mean, going from 500 to 700 to 900,
Wow. So
really great scaling, amazing culture. And then suddenly you're at Cisco, which is like the biggest of the big,
Right.
when you're at kind of a Fortune 50 type company. And interestingly, I knew a lot of people that jumped almost immediately. And that was another one where I stuck it out for 3 years. And it was good because that was another seasoning period where I got a chance to see much bigger teams, much broader discipline. But functionally, when I was at Tandberg, I started off in a strategy pricing role, which is kind of normal ex-consultant. That quickly turned into a global product marketing type role. And then at Cisco, it quickly became a GM role. And that's where, I think that's where the career starts to pivot. When you finally feel like I've been checking the boxes to show that I can do finance, and to show that I can do marketing, and to show that I can do strategy, and to have teams of 5 or 10 or 20. And then suddenly it's like, you're actually a general manager. Like it's you and your team. And that actually for me started with a couple small teams, 10 or 20 here, but pretty quickly I had kind of 10 different teams, each of, 10 or 20 or 30 people on them. And then that was really fun. And that even though I was at a big company, I felt like I was my own mini CEO.
Sure.
And that's where I think what gave me the confidence to jump and start something was seeing, okay, number one, I can juggle a lot of balls in the air at one period of time. And you realize as a personality, because you might think this about yourself, but until you've done it, you don't know, that I am definitely broad. I like to have the breadth and kind of strategy, big picture, as opposed to being like, I am the accounting expert, and that's where the fun came in. Ironically, I felt like I was sort of a above average accountant and an above average marketing guy, but I was never like the top of any of those. But I actually think when you push me across all of it, I'm actually pretty good.
Yeah.
And so that was the fun of that journey. The Tandberg Cisco move was kind of moving very quickly from functional roles to a general management view of the world, and learning about myself that I really like this a lot.
Yeah.
That's really fun.
Makes sense. Yeah. You're kind of in that position of having control of a team and seeing the direction and then the bigger picture there. So when did you start thinking in your mind, okay, I have an idea, or what was the idea? How did you think about it? Was Avizia the next thing, or was there something in between?
Avizia was the next thing, but interestingly, it started at Cisco. So when we came over, we got acquired around 2010. I think it was 2009 when it started, and closed in 2010. And I was running a couple different teams, some functional teams, sales engineers and some product marketing. And I think I finally, when you're at a big company, you can either take two tracks. One is you just sort of lock yourself into the time and hierarchy game of, if I wait long enough, I make, director, and then I make senior director, and then and you're kind of on a track. or you sort of choose to be entrepreneurial in your environment and you make more aggressive moves to proactively shape your career. And for me, I was enjoying some of these functional teams that I was running, but there was a small team that was making, and I just have always loved tech and product. They were making product. They were trying to take this video conferencing technology and make it relevant in other industries, education, military, healthcare. And it was kind of like a redheaded stepchild, in the portfolio, maybe doing $500K, $1 million a year. And I remember I looked around at my skills and the team that was in place, and suddenly no longer being at Tandberg, a small company where I felt like I could be, one of the top 3 people pretty soon. And now I'm at Cisco, massive. I'm like, okay, what's going to keep me interested if I stick it out here? And so I remember like putting this pitch together and flying to London to pitch the GM, where I'm like, okay, I've got this grand idea. I want to take this team over. And it was funny because I expected this was gonna be like a 5-hour meeting, and we're like 20 minutes and he's like, it's yours. I could care less. Like, take the team.
Wow.
And this was, by the time I flew back on Monday, I remember getting on a video call, and it's like, Hollywood Squares, where the old team, the whole team gets on, and like, who's this guy, Mike? And the prior manager of this group was like, I'm no longer your manager. He's your manager. Peace out. And,
wow.
And they're like, I've never even met this guy, right? But it was fun because to me, that was actually starting a company, even though I was inside of another company. Mm-hmm. And so that was the start of this little core. So I had 200 some odd people at the time, about 10 that were focusing on what felt more like a business. And I spent about 2 years getting some key hires. Long story short, it was a team that really did a bunch of grant work. And so it was like one-off custom products. And my strategy was, well, let's go from 20 products that do $50K each to like 5 products that can do $1 million each. That was kind of the theory. Let's concentrate it. And we started to have a little bit of traction. So we kind of cleaned out the portfolio, picked a few winners, built a few new products, probably got it up to about $1 million run rate, which is nothing in a place like Cisco. But importantly, there were 3 areas that were interesting. One was military, one was education, one was healthcare. And we started doing a lot of this telemedicine stuff around connecting doctors in remote places for hospitals. And we had a few really marquee customers like Kaiser Permanente and
Sure.
the VA. And I remember about 2012 going to the management saying, I think this could be really big. Like, this telemedicine thing is going to be big someday. Can I get a bunch of investment, to go grow this? And kind of the feeling I got from the uppity people, the uppers at the company was like, don't waste your time. Just keep doing what you're doing. All these other things you're doing are great. Your career here is great. Don't worry about this. I'm like, but this is something I'm passionate about. And that actually ended up culminating. So I always joke and say I started being a CEO in 2010, even though I didn't start my company until 2013. What that turned into is I actually ended up spinning off that tiny team to be my company.
Oh, wow.
And so that actually was the fun thing. And again, I guess a lesson when I talk to other people is you never know where your idea is going to come from. You never know where your moment's going to happen. And by the way, I was not a healthcare guy. I didn't know anything about healthcare. I was tech, consumer electronics and, video conferencing and stuff like that. And suddenly I felt like I was on the edge. I was like in the driver's seat of an industry that was about to transform, and everyone else was too dumb to know it. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I got to do something here. And so interestingly, what then happened was, as 2012 kind of wound down, Cisco's one of those companies that almost every year does like a mass layoff to hit earnings.
Okay.
And so in the spring of 2013, we start right to the plan. Okay, where are we going to cut people from the portfolio? And, our group was one of the fastest growing. When you're growing from 100K to 500K to $1 million, you look fast. And Cisco loved it because when you're at a company like Cisco, you get to advertise servers and racks, and that's not really exciting. But when you want to do a Super Bowl ad and you can show, like AT&T will do the same thing, these dramatic commercials where it's like an ambulance and someone's dead and suddenly here's this product that saves lives. Mm-hmm. That's a lot more exciting than we're a route switch company,
Sure,
and that was kind of our product. I mean, we actually made an ad. I can't remember if it was in the Super Bowl or something. I'm like, one of my products that I made is like in front of a national audience. And I was so pumped about that.
Yeah.
But again, Cisco didn't want to grow it. And so I went to them in 2013 and said, before you go fire a bunch of people, in Norway or wherever, why don't you fire me? Mm. And so that actually ended up being how we started our company. Is I got two of my buddies who were working for me on that team. We went to Cisco and said, we'd like you to fire us. And by the way, we want you to give us a deal where we have licensing rights to these 5 products. We want you to give us some seed money for it. And you're going to pay our salaries for 6 months as part of severance. And suddenly that became a company. And I won't bore you with the details, but one of the interesting things about it is when Cisco had acquired Tamberg, they had picked up a product that was effectively an FDA, regulated product, a class 1 medical device. And Cisco was like, we don't want to deal with this. We don't do medical. And so I originally kind of negotiated a deal where I'd spin this off, but Cisco would keep some of the equity or something. And when Cisco Legal heard about it, they were like, not only are you going to spin this off, but we're not going to have any equity. Yeah, because we don't want to have any perception that we're offloading risk. I'm like, no, if that's the deal you need to have, I guess it's going to be okay. So I feel like this is one of those things where I don't play poker, but I feel like it's one of those hands where you're like, I've got a 2 and a 4 and a 6, and someone's going to like hand me a business. And again, it definitely had its warts and challenges, but I loved it because it was sort of like, this never would have happened if someone hadn't decided to do something crazy. And that's kind of how we pulled it out and started Avizia. And sorry for the long windup, but that was the catalyst for us to suddenly have a company that in a way I had founded a couple years earlier and sort of started to nurture and prove out under a much more supportive infrastructure, but got to a point where I believed it enough that I was ready to go take the jump.
Successful business is all about finding that product market fit and a problem to be solved. Yeah. And to your point, people, I think a lot of times want to find some shiny object or some new thing, but to your story, you were kind of an entrepreneur. You saw this, hey, we can make telehealth better. We can use our product to do something better in a bigger way. And so that's great. You can look where you are to find business ideas. And that's exactly what you did. So very cool.
It's funny because prior to this, like I remember when I was at McKinsey and thinking, I remember Airbnb was starting like, I got to think of an idea like this. You always look at some big, huge company and think, what's the next Google and what's the next Airbnb and what's the next, AI thing or whatever. And you try to anchor yourselves to these grand, big ideas, as opposed to like lots of people make a ton of money off of relatively simple businesses where there's less, competitors, and they just focus and they have a niche, you know. And not that telemedicine was a niche, but at the time, no one was doing telehealth, right? And it wasn't, like I said, we were doing less than $1 million. But yeah, it ended up being an idea that we could lean into and do something about.
And so you were able to negotiate with Cisco. Was that pretty clean break then? I mean, they did the severance.
It took like 6 months to figure it all out. Because you can imagine it's like me, my cheap lawyer, whoever the cheapest lawyer I could find, and like 20 people on the Cisco team. Like, as you can imagine, they're not normally spinning things out.
Right.
But we had built up some good friendships and things within the group and had worked hard. And so people, frankly, they were really nice to us to let us do this. And it was in their interest because on the one hand, we were taking kind of a group of 10 people and a couple of these products, and yet they had an install base where they needed support. And so we actually sort of negotiated a forward service contract paid today, if that made sense. And that became our seed capital. Yeah. We sort of said, hey, you're going to need people to support your install base, and we're taking everyone out the door. And they're like, okay, that's probably worth some money to us. So here's a little bit of money. Yeah. And, I wish we would have asked for more, but it was enough to like get something started. Yeah. And really interesting way to start a business.
Yeah, very unique. So at the end of the day, it was no equity, but you kind of had this severance and you had the IP, you had what you needed to go hit the ground running. Yep. Very cool. So tell us, that was 2013.
Yeah, 2013.
Tell us about that run.
And then it got interesting, right? That's when suddenly you're CEO, you've got a lease, you've got a business, you got payroll you got to make. And again, we were fortunate. We within about a year, we had grown that roughly $1 million portfolio into about 5-6 million or so of revenue. And actually, I think we were profitable in that first year. But what we realized, I didn't really have the IP. I had licenses to the IP, right? So I was able to use some of this stuff, and it wasn't like they were ever going to build it, but we knew we had to have our own product pretty quick. And I had initially kind of brought out a few products from all three of those verticals: healthcare, military, and education. But we figured out really quickly that the total addressable market was much bigger in healthcare, and that was going to be our focus. And so in that first year where we started to make a little bit of money, it was an all-out sprint to build our own product, something that we own. It was the IP and could be a next gen. Most of these products had been around for at least a couple of years. And, with technology, things are always ramping up. And so we were in an all-out sprint to build a new product. And again, we were like 12 people, but we managed in that year to build a new product. And again, at the time, the way the FDA treated this stuff was as a medical device. Mm-hmm. And even our software was like a medical device, which was really interesting. We had been audited at Cisco by the FDA, which is not fun when you're trying to figure this stuff out. They've since loosened the rules a ton on it, but I remember being super small. We're trying to get FDA approval, build our own quality management system, all the things to be a medical device company. And it was just a crazy sprint, but we got there with some interesting stories along the way. And then I felt like we were a real company. Now we have a couple old products that paid the bills, but now we have our own product, our own brand, and we can start to go push. And that's when it started to pivot for us. And when we transitioned to more of a venture-backed company where it's all about growth as opposed to, let's just take a year and see if people are going to buy this and prove it. And if it doesn't work out, we can all just quit, go take a different job. No one's really on the hook. I mean, it was like I took a loan from the bank using my house as collateral, but it wasn't the end of the world kind of a thing, right? But by that point, well, it's funny because everyone has like an oh crap moment in their entrepreneur story. And one of mine was at that year mark. I remember the day we launched that new product, I had taken out a loan from a bank like across the street. This is how unsophisticated we were. Like, well, we need a loan. Oh, there's a bank right over there who remained unnamed. Let's just go get a loan there. It's like, oh, we'll give you $1 million line of credit, based on your house and whatever. I'm like, okay, this is great. But they were not. It wasn't SVB, right? It wasn't people that are like aligned to venture growth. And I remember at this year mark, we had been working with our loan officer who loved us because most of his portfolio was very boring, businesses. And like, I've got this tech company. And I remember in all of his excitement to try and grow his business, he had pitched us on some new services. Like, can you sign up for this thing or this thing? We're like, sure, if it's going to help you. And one of those services we had applied for, it was probably like automatic check deposits or something stupid, triggered a look at our company, and whoever the secondary loan officer that came in was like, "You're investing in a tech company with that?" And
oh my gosh!
And we now had, we were now starting to burn money intentionally to grow, and they totally freaked out. And so one of the weird moments in my whole life was literally the day we unveiled this product. Like, we take the curtain off this cart, we've got all these people on video, we have cake, it's great. And then as soon as we're done, we're going to meet the bank guys. And we go in the boardroom, me and my two co-founders and the bank guys, and our loan officer and his, we always joke, Angela from Special Assets, showed up. And we're like, oh, who's Angela? And we get into this conversation. And she's like, yeah, we're actually calling the loan, and we need you guys to like come up with a bunch of cash in the next 30 days. And we were like, what the heck? We've had like this amazing year. And I think we're about 9-10 months in at this point. We felt all triumphant. And I literally walked from that celebration to this room where a bomb got dropped on us. And we had to put a bunch of capital in. It was like $200K, which was a ton of money. And just the way it worked out, I was the only one that kind of had assets. So 80% of that was from me and 20% from my partners. I was a little freaked out, but you talk about moments, that's when it really got real. And so we covered it. We got out of that bank, found a new bank, ended up doing a seed round at that point, bringing investors in. And that's when we really transitioned from being this weird idea to an actual true startup. We had money. We could go start to hire ahead of growth. We could start to, run some deficits intentionally. We started investing in software. Just to short circuit the story, we bought 2 other companies that were competitors. So over a 5-year period, we took what was this weird business that nobody wanted, doing hardware at 10% margins, and we're suddenly on a 30 million run rate with a bunch of SaaS, a software platform. We're in this hot telemedicine space. And I didn't know this at the time when we started, but telemedicine was not just our idea. It was a lot of people's ideas. And there was 300 different telemedicine companies that kind of started about the same time. Now, of course, they're going to Sequoia and whoever and raising, hundreds of millions of dollars. And here I am I took $1 million seed round and here we're going to go. What was crazy about that 5-year journey is by the time we were done in 2018, we were a top 10 company. We were in a third of all hospitals in the country, and we had built something really cool. So it was just an amazing experience from that weird little product that I flew to London and said, can I take this thing over? And I remember one of my friends who I used to work with, when he heard about us being bought, he's like, man, you just took, he probably used some dirty word, but this piece of garbage and you turned it into a diamond. And you're like, well, that's entrepreneurship for you.
Yeah. Amazing. And to clarify the product, these are hardware, cameras, microphones you're installing in doctors' offices and hospitals.
It started as these carts that we, had TV and a camera and, what we call a codec, but hardware codecs as opposed to software ones. But it's literally like, imagine your DVD player, something that would do all the processing. Mm-hmm. But what was significant about them is you could plug in different peripherals, so different cameras to look in your ear, look at your eye, and that's where it started, because that's how markets start. But pretty soon, when you have hospitals that have lots of these devices, well, now I need the software. And then, the doctor on the far end needs scheduling software. And how does this integrate with the medical record? And how does this, take care of billing? And how do I do paging to find the right doctors? And so it ended up needing, by the time we were done, we were, 70% subscription SaaS software, 20% hardware, and like 10% services.
Got it.
And so it was a very different business 5 years later when we were done with this. And by that point, the market had matured quite a bit. We ended up, after buying a few companies ourselves, being bought by the number 2 player in the space. We got offers from the top 3. Ended up going to Amwell, American Well, spent 2 years there as president and prepping for an IPO. And basically got the S1, I wrote the S1 for the IPO, and we're sitting on it as we're working with our advisors. And this is March of 2020, Yeah. and we're at the second biggest telemedicine company in the world. And in March of 2020, our volume went up 30x. I could imagine. In 1 month. I mean, it was the most insane, crazy period of my life. And I had been prepping kind of the time to potentially leave. I was kind of number 2 to take over the company if things went in the right, direction. But interestingly, because of COVID and the pandemic, suddenly telemedicine, for 10 years, I've been like, this is the next big thing. Next year's going to be a big year. And, 10 years later, it was our big year, right? COVID happened. Right. Everything went crazy. And, but it was really neat to eventually have an IPO. So we had an IPO in 2020. And so to kind of see something over a 10-year period go from a startup where we had a handful of customers and not any real products to being literally like one of the top 2 or 3 players in the space. We were in half of all hospitals by that point. Wow. We had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. A lot of our work was in the telestroke arena. So where people are having a stroke and they need access to a neurologist immediately. We were doing a ton in behavioral health, a ton with pediatrics. And it was just the most gratifying journey to see that, me and my 2 partners, we had no idea when we started this, how this was going to land. This was just we're bored and sick of being in a big company. Let's start something. And suddenly we kind of created an industry together. I ended up being on the American Telemedicine Board for 6 years. I'm almost wrapped up now, but today, telemedicine is a thing, right? I mean, everyone uses, and video is a thing. That was the other bet. When I went to Tandberg in 2009, I thought someday this video conferencing thing is going to be cool. We're going to use video a lot. Never would have predicted, today that I live on video, right? I have almost a totally virtual, lifestyle. And so I feel fortunate to have having been at the crossroads of a couple really neat technologies. But again, I didn't sit back and just ride that, because it would have been interesting to be a senior director or VP at Cisco doing something in video. Instead, I ended up getting to be an entrepreneur and have some more directed technologies. And it was just a lot of fun. Yeah. Amazing. The transaction with Amwell, can you talk a little bit about the structure there? Yeah. Was that everything you'd hoped it was or would have been? And then the subsequent IPO? I mean, how did that end up for you? It's so interesting. And so I do a lot on the investing side now. I'm an operating partner at a small healthcare fund that invested in us. And so I've been there for 7 years now, and we've looked at deals. And now I realize there's a lot of challenges with first-time founders, because you hit a point where every dollar sounds great. Sure. I remember the first time we raised money and we got a valuation, it was $7 million. And we're like, you start doing the math. You're like, well, wait, if I am on a third and you on a third and you on a third, this is actually real money. Right. This was like a science project we were messing around with, but now it's actually something real. And obviously by the time you get to the end, it's worth a lot more than that, which is exciting. Though it is this weird pressure, because, as I'm sure my investors were like, guys, if you keep going, this could be worth more. But we realized at that point we were kind of a top 10 company, and there still were 300 companies. This has been a space that's been really hot and everyone was investing in prior to COVID. After COVID, it went even more crazy. We felt like if industries eventually kind of move towards an oligopoly stage where you're going to have a couple big players and you don't really want to be left on the outs. And so I felt strongly at the time that we're going to go a lot farther if we start to combine. And interestingly, after we did this, the other two big companies did something almost copycat moves. Like you could start to see the industry consolidating, and I felt good about that. But what was interesting is the way I pitched it to my investors was, look, this is what we need to do for our growth. Partially because we were hitting a Series B, even though we had done like 4 or 5 mini rounds and, Series A prime and seed rounds and venture debt rounds, et cetera. But you start running the numbers, and it was something like, I think we were going to raise 70 million in our Series B. And I remember imputing out like, what would the numbers have to be for the VC to make their money? And it was something like, I got to get to like 400 million in top line revenue, and I'm sitting at 30 today or whatever it was. The math just didn't work for me. I'm like, that's going to be really hard in this space. And so that was part of what drove me to combine. And I think where some of our investors probably would have liked to go a little longer, they trusted it. But part of how I set it up was we ended up doing a setup where I think the core deal for the company was half cash, half stock. Okay. And I ended up overweighting on the equity, sort of as a gesture of goodwill to my board that, look, I really believe this is going to be more valuable as a combined company. And so I'll take a little bit off now. And I think it's always good to take a little bit off. So I ended up doing 1/3 cash and 2/3 stock. And it ended up being a really good setup for everyone. It was nice for the founders to get a little bit off the table. It's always nice to know that you can pay off your house and your kids' education's done, and you take some vacations that you're in need of. But for me, it was also a good demonstration to the acquiring party that I'm really committed to this, and I believe this has a lot more upside. I'm not just running away. And so that's how I had structured it, and then that ended up being really good for us at the time. We were about 30 some odd in SaaS. The acquiring company was around 60, 65, so sub 100 combined. And over the next 2 years, we grew it to 200 plus, almost 250. And then obviously COVID happened and things got a little bit crazy. But it ended up working out well when we finally had an IPO and, was able to cash out.
Amazing.
I was happy for that.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations. That's amazing. So in going from there, I saw you had Waterline Ventures, which sounds like kind of something you're doing with
this
some other
was
founders.
One of our original investors, and they invited me on as an operating partner. And so we probably have 40 or 50 companies. We're now on Fund 4, and it's just been a great way to look at healthcare investing. So I do a lot of that on the side and help. My job is usually to mentor CEOs and be on the deal side. I love investing. Yeah. So that's been a lot of fun as a side project still.
Is that with your own capital? Are you raising capital, both?
Yeah. We've got real funds. We raise institutional capital and, family capital and things of that nature. But it's been a fun way to work with some really great guys in a focused area. But it's more of a part-time, they're full-time. I'm more part-time. But it's been great to stay involved with the latest tech because it moves so fast. Like when you're in it and your area, but like healthcare, think of all the tech innovations happening in healthcare today. So I've loved being an operating partner there.
Yeah, amazing. So you have this exit, Amwell merges, you're there for a few years, and then you leave ultimately. What was the next step in the journey?
So this is where, you always have these weird decision points, and we're on the verge of an IPO, and I had kind of been prepped that probabilities were good that I could take over as CEO in the near term. And once you've been CEO and that's right for you, you want to stay CEO. It's fun. And it's really hard to go back to being number 2. I worked with some really great people and I enjoyed it. But when COVID happened right in the middle of our IPO cycle, I think that changed the math a little bit for the current CEO. And they wanted to stick around longer than expected. And so, which was fine with me. I'm like, then it's probably time for me to go look at something else. And an IPO is kind of a natural transition point. So I ended up choosing to exit right as we IPO'd, which ended up being really, really beneficial because what we didn't know, was obviously anything related to COVID went up massively. Think Peloton, think
Right.
telemedicine stocks, et cetera. But unfortunately, those cycles, you tend to pull in a ton of business, and now you're a public company and you go from like 30% a year type growth to 5%,
Yeah.
And so it ended up being very fortuitous for me, because since I left right at the IPO, I could sell.
Yeah.
No one else could. And you never know how these things are. I was actually a little scared. I feel like I'm walking away from this amazing business and this peak of and you got to remember, what were you thinking in April of 2020? Like,
right.
is this going to last forever or 2 years or who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But it ended up working out for me. At one point, I think our market cap hit $7 billion in valuation,
Wow.
which, by the way, is super exciting to feel like you were part of that kind of creation. Unfortunately, today, if you go look at that market set, Teladoc, American Well, I think Amwell's at like 150 million today.
Oh, wow.
And again, that was the COVID fall off, right? And so it ended up being very fortuitous because I could sell. And, when you're a top executive at a publicly traded company, it's really hard to sell your equity. But anyway, so I ended up kind of going out to market and seeing what was out there. And I got recruited to be CEO of Henry Schein One. So I had now been a healthcare SaaS CEO for 8 some odd years. And here was this company in Utah that I'd never heard of before. And, my wife's from Utah. I went to school here. I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting. In fact, when I returned the recruiter's call, Henry Schein One is actually owned partially by a parent company, Henry Schein. They're based in New York. I'm like, this is a New York company I'm calling about. I'm an East Coast guy. I've lived in DC for over a decade now. And I remember talking to the recruiter, and she's like, well, no, this is actually in Salt Lake City. Would you ever have an interest in going to Salt Lake City? I'm like, I have zero desire to be in Salt Lake City, but my wife would love that, you know? No offense to Salt Lake City, because now I love it. But that was another big change for me, because I came to Henry Schein One, which is probably the biggest software company in Utah you've never heard of. I mean, it's big. It's the Microsoft of dental, well over $500 million in revenues, 2,500 employees, 12 countries that, 70 products. And it's right here in Utah. And that was a really fun experience for me, again, to test myself. I'd done McKinsey things where you're talking with big CEOs, and then Cisco, where I'd run some big company, big teams, but then it's like back to small as a startup. Mm-hmm. And we kind of grew that to Amwell, where we were a pretty good sized company. But now it was like, not just good size, but I'm the CEO again. And this isn't the VC world. Now it's private equity. They were part owned by KKR.
Okay.
And that was a fun experience to do something at a different level of scale. And for me, I loved it. So while I love being startup and the entrepreneur and being able to craft every part of the story, there's nothing like the leverage you get when you have 2,500 employees. Like, you can make all kinds of big change. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was fun for me is suddenly I was in the dental world, which I knew nothing about. Like, healthcare doesn't mean that you understand every facet of healthcare.
Sure.
And it was fun to be in Utah, which is a totally different market. You and I were talking before the podcast, how much I left Utah in 1999, and now I'm coming back in 2020. It was a totally different place in that time. Yeah. And really enjoyed being here. And that got me into dental. So it was a fun experience to make that change.
And how long were you there as CEO?
I was there for almost 3 years, kind of got into the dental space, and somewhere along the line that entrepreneurship bug started to hit again, and I wanted to try something new, and that led to my new company, Accelerate Dental.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, when you step back in that CEO role, did it feel like a job, or was it still like, I love this, I could do this for a decade, or was it like, it sounds like ultimately, you had that itch again, but what was the mentality for those 3 years?
I loved being at a big company. And by that point, you feel like you finally start to get to reap the rewards of the work that you've done. So best salary I've ever had, best benefits, you feel like you're kind of a big deal when you're running something big, especially in an industry like that. You're running like one of the major player in the industry, you're the Microsoft, and that was a lot of fun. But I also, there's inevitably going to be politics and, things of that nature that go on. And I had an itch to start something new again. And part of it was the same feelings that I had when I started Avizia. I felt like I'm in the front row seat of a market transition that nobody else seems to know. I would like to think nobody else knows about, as I proved with Avizia. There's 300 other, telemedicine companies, but I felt like nobody else knew about it. I felt like I need to do something. And for me, that was kind of this private equity roll-up space of PE firms that are called DSOs, dental support organizations, where they'll roll up practices. And so all of the companies doing this were customers of mine. And so I'm watching what they're doing, like, this is a really cool business model. I kind of like this. And it really started to get my attention. And I felt like, well, what do I want the next 10 years of my career to look like? And the idea of actually being the owner and the operator, and like, I want to be the VC, I want to be the PE firm, I want to grow something on my own. And I think this has unlimited potential. That was probably more of what struck the entrepreneur bug for me that time. And so I stepped down in 23 and started Accelerate. And then that took its own weird turn because I quickly learned that there were 250 other companies doing the same thing as me.
And how do you not get discouraged? Because I've had ideas, even within the real estate space, wouldn't it be so nice to be able to have this or this tech piece? But then you look, there's already 3 or 4 or 5 companies doing it. How do you not get discouraged or say, it's too concentrated?
Well, I have 2 thoughts there. One is because I still think of myself as a product guy, and I remember when I was still an undergrad and before I graduated, this is when MP3 players were really cool. You'd buy this $100, $200 little brick that you'd put songs on, and it would cost tons of money, and it would hold like 25 songs, and they're like, this is so amazing. And I always think about this story because there were probably 10 decently sized reputation companies that had done this, and you're like, this is the next big thing. And then Apple comes along, with the iPhone and really the iPod, and totally obliterates them. I mean, none of those companies even exist today,
right.
And yet they were at the beginning. And I've always looked at that as an example of technology and products change. And until someone really nails it, like the other example that I always use is suitcases. This is so dumb, but like for, 300 years, people were carrying around trunks and like these big fat suitcases. And someone invents the rollerboard, and like overnight,
right.
everything's a rollerboard, right?
Right.
And so I never feel like just because someone else is doing it doesn't mean there's not a better way.
Yeah.
And so, but what that means, and this is really what put us on the very weird journey that is Accelerate, is you have to start with product 101, right? So what's everybody else offering, and what am I going to offer?
Yeah.
And how am I going to be differentiated? And so that's where, from the point that I decided I wanted to leave and do something entrepreneurial, and I probably started with, I'm going to do the same as everyone else. This seems like a no-brainer industry. You go in, you buy a bunch of practices, you flip them, you sell it to private equity, make a lot of money, right? But unfortunately, I have 2 problems with that. One is I got to get customer feedback first. It's just my product guy and me. 2, I've always had kind of a moral obligation to do something that's good for society. And the 2 of those hit pretty hard in healthcare. And so what happened for us is, after I decided to leave, of course, I probably should have thought of this before I left, but we started interviewing dentists, and I talked to probably 100 dentists. And what I quickly learned is dentists did not like this consolidation. They definitely had some perceptions about it. They thought, this is like the big evil empire rolling up. It's like the Walmart story, putting out all the mom and pops out of business.
Yep.
That was number 1. And number 2, having come up through the healthcare ranks and spent so much time in the delivery of healthcare, and really benefited from private equity and VC involvement in healthcare, one of the big trends in healthcare is that over the last 20, 30 years, physicians have been rolled up into corporate healthcare. And again, I'm not here to say that's right or that's wrong. It's certainly been good for investors. Today, 80% of physicians are part of a corporate-owned group. Wow. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when I was a kid, everyone wanted to be a doctor, and you can own your own clinic, and you're like important part of the community, and everyone loves Dr. Smith or whatever. But today, people aren't as excited about going into being a doctor, generally speaking, because it's much more corporate controlled. And frankly, a lot of the doctors we have are coming from overseas because they see this as a great place to be. And so when I looked at that statistic of 80% of doctors being rolled up and contrast it with dental at this point in time when I was about to roll, it was about 20%. And so I went, okay, there's a learning here. And so back to why you start a business and why you can compete against 250 competitors. The key learnings for us were that, 1, the market's 20% consolidated, but it's probably going to get to 80 over the next 10 years. 2, that was very regionally specific. So it was 20% across the country, but it wasn't 20% anywhere.
Got it.
It was 40% in Florida and Texas and, some of the Sun Belt states. And it was like less than 10 in Utah and less than 5 in Idaho. And, some of these Mountain West states were much slower. And so we thought, hey, we have an opportunity to get out and do something before everyone comes here. So that's part of it is speed.
Sure.
And then our third knowledge was, wait, most doctors actually don't love this trend. And so how are we going to make it different? And what ended up coming out after that was literally a year of what felt like, formulas on a blackboard, the Einstein E equals MC squared, where we sort of brainstormed over and over again. Well, what if we did this way? And what if we did this way? And we ended up kind of landing on a model that was so totally different than what everyone else was doing that we felt differentiated. And then at that point, even though we started, I literally quit my job January of 23. We basically didn't really do business until January of 2024. We spent a whole year refining the model, talking to dentists, we bought one practice, but that's not enough to run a business off of. And now we have 30 in the last year.
Wow.
We were fine tuning the model. And so for me, back to your original question, it's all about, are you going to do it different?
Yep.
Because if you're just going to copy everybody else, well, then you're going to have to be cheaper or make less profit, or you're going to have to be better looking or have better exercise. Somewhere you've got to have some differentiator. And the product takeaway for us was there are a lot of things we can do different. And we ultimately settled on a few things that really set us apart.
And to the extent you can share, Accelerate Dental mentioned in the bio initially, it sounds like there's some sort of upside for potentially the owners of these practices or partnership structure. But would love if you could just lay out, here's what a typical transaction looks like.
Well, I'll hit on first kind of the three things that differentiate us. So I'm sure a lot of your audience is used to investments and, the typical investor model. So an investor model in this space is very much, we're going to go buy practices out at the lowest multiple we can. And we're going to buy 80 to 100% of that practice. So we've got control. We're going to get some operational efficiency in the practices, and then we're going to resell it to somebody else. And hopefully you buy it at 4 and you sell it at 12 and everyone makes money, right?
Yep.
That formula makes sense. And one thing I love about dental, by the way, is it's not easy, but it's simple is how I describe it. Like running software, it's complicated. I feel like there's 1,000 different things that make or break your products. Whereas our business is like get more patients in the door, do a better job of collections, cut your costs a little bit. It's good. It's more straightforward. Our takeaway was, we're going to do 3 things that are different. The first is that we are always going to be a minority partner in the practice. So right off the get-go, this would be, as an investor, the dumbest thing that you could possibly do. We're going to make sure that we are a minority and we can't enforce the things we want to do. But for a dentist, this is everything. This is a clinical area where they want to feel like they own that relationship with the patient and they don't want someone telling them what to do. And the feedback that people have gotten after joining some of these groups is they felt like they're having to change the way they practice. And so we come out right from the get-go and say, frankly, we agree. And we're going to be minority partners in the practice. Our average ownership in practices is around 38%. So, and we usually dilute with them. So if we bring in other associates and they get ownership, we dilute. And we're okay with that because we want the dentist to be at the front. Again, probably not the best answer for an investor, but it's fantastic for the doctors. The second big thing that we did is, we have a top co, an LLC that owns our practices, is we wanted that to be dentist owned and not private equity owned. And so I self-funded it. We got some friends and family and a couple dentists to invest, but we have about 90% of our dentists are owners in this. And frankly, they all have an option to buy in when they have money and time. And I suspect all will in time, because not only do we want to be aligned at the practice level, we wanted to be aligned at the top co. So we're going in a direction that's good for you, the dentist. The third thing that we did that was very different is we said, literally in our operating agreement before we had a single practice, we said the management team is not allowed to sell this. So again, not the best thing if you're an investor, but we wanted our intentions to be very clear with the doctors, and they have the right to. They have a vote if they ever wanted to sell it, that they could. But we've settled on what we call a perpetual model. And so one of my key takeaways is, if you've looked at what's happening to healthcare and roll-ups, as you know, are happening in barbershops and chiropractors and car washes and HVACs, and every industry in the country is being rolled up by private equity. And we said, is that the only way to do this? And we were looking for analogs in other markets. And one that we settled on is if you look at professional services, so specifically accountants, lawyers, and management consultants, they tend to not follow these models, though I'm sure private equity will try to roll them up soon enough. But in businesses where there's a degree of trust between you and the service provider, I think you like when you go to your accountant knowing that he or she is telling you advice because it's the right advice, not because they're a publicly traded company that needs to grow at 30% a year, and that might have a little bit of a bent on the advice that they give you.
Right.
And so we settled on what we call the perpetual model, which is if you come into our group and we're going to be a part owner, we're going to hopefully use our best practices to uplift your business operations and make things better, not so that we can sell you to another private equity company in a recap, but so that you can sell to another doctor.
Yeah.
And that doctor is actually going to pay you a lot more than they would have if you were a solo practice, because it's now a better practice. It's got way better profitability. It's usually a multi-doctor practice. So there's resiliency when the guy's name on the door disappears. The patients don't all leave because there's more than one doctor. And we think that you can approximate the same kind of returns that you would get in a private equity world. But because you kept more ownership up front, which means you keep more distributions of profit while we grow it, we've changed the way that pie is split, you're actually going to have similar outcomes. Oh, and by the way, you didn't sell out your whole industry.
Right.
And so those three things are what really set us apart. Is we said, look, and again, I don't mean to knock other players in the space. They can do it however they want. They're doing great. And we actually copy a lot of things they do to be better. But our view is that ultimately in healthcare, you're better off. We have a strong view that a dentist-owned practice is better, not just for the dentist, but it's better for their staff, it's better for the community, and it's better for their patients. And so we just have a different view. So with those three things, we felt very differentiated. And so our model is very different. We don't go in and say, hey, we're going to go get 80% leverage on this practice and buy you out. And this is very much a multiple arbitrage. It's very much a leverage strategy with banks, and then hopefully we can sell it out. That actually ended up being good, because while at the point when I left, DSO interest had never been higher. Kind of post-COVID, a lot of dentists said, this is too stressful, I'm going to join a DSO. But as you know, interest rates changed in that environment. And so suddenly that normal methodology of we're going to take on a ton of debt and go do this. And ironically, about a fifth or even a fourth of DSOs have gone bankrupt over the last 2 years because they're so heavily debt levered.
Yeah.
Adjustable rates, they're never going to go up, right? And suddenly we've got 8, 9, 10% interest rates for this kind of lending. We have no debt at all. I mean, we go in and we sign deals with these practices where we have a very novel financing strategy where we come in and basically set what's your value today. We don't want to take that from you at all. We're only going to participate in the growth. So we're sort of 50-50 partners or 30-70 or whatever on the upside. And so that kind of puts a floor for the dentist. What I've already created is mine. The distribution I get today is mine. I don't need to worry about that. And this is an investment partner to help me grow, and they're going to play on the upside. That led to less debt from us. We let them swap some of that equity, into our top co, which lets us get a little more buy-in quicker. And it ends up being very much a win-win thing. So what comes out of that is their owners in the top co, we get a reason to participate in driving the operations, and yet we can still have this different model where the pie is split very differently. It's not I get 90% and you get 10. It's like, well, I get 30 and you get 70. And that's actually great for the industry. So it ended up evolving quite a bit from where we started.
And average 38% ownership, what's like a typical check that you're writing? What's the multiple or valuation that you're seeing?
Most practice. So the other thing that because of the way we're structured, if you're in a private equity based model, you want to have the most leverage possible, meaning you're going to start with practices that are actually doing pretty well and you can make them better, as opposed to let's go find, dumpster fires and, there's just too much work involved and you're trying to do a recap in 5 years. So most private equity firms won't even talk to a practice if they're not doing over $1.5 million in collections. Well, the average practice in the country is doing $750K. Okay. So about half of the market isn't even under consideration. Well, we're not restrained by that at all. We'll go talk to a $600,000 practice or a $800,000 practice all day long, and they're still doing good. You can almost think of them as break even. If you took out a fair doctor's salary, there's no profit. And so we can come in and say, great, well, we can share 50-50 in everything that we grow because we're starting from a base of zero. Yeah. And when you get leverage on something, a fixed asset business where adding associates, adding hours, whatever, you can get a lot of profit out of that. it ends up being a great growth trajectory. And so usually there's no check for us. That's the punchline of all this is usually it's we'll do an equity swap of some sort because we want them in our top co. We're usually doing kind of a 3.5 to 5.5x valuation, depending on how big they are. Because we want to be similar to market valuations, the DSOs. We're probably a half turn less because we don't take a controlling interest. But the doctors love it because there's a big price to be paid on maintaining your sovereignty and being able to kind of run your practice. Yeah. And so interestingly, we've kind of worked this out in a way that we actually don't exchange a lot of cash in these. It's much more about the upside. And then what we've ended up showing over time, we ended up buying another group early on that got us a double-digit start on those practices and then adding, 10 plus this last year to get to 30. When we look at those practices that have been with us for kind of 4 or 5 years, usually at that 4 or 5 year mark, we've doubled the practice. We've taken the profit up 6 or 7 times. So like, even if you only own a third of it, you're making way more money than you were before on your profit distributions. Yeah. And usually the doctor's personal income is up 50% over that time period. So it ends up being like this massive win-win-win. And they didn't give up their autonomy. They can still, so it changes the relationship because we're a coach and a mentor and a peer, not a manager. Yeah. Because a lot of these PE models, and again, no disrespect to them, but it's very much well, if I need to, I'm going to fire you and I will fire everyone on your staff because my job is to create profit for my investors. And ours is very much, I'm going to come to you with 3 options and I can tell you, this is what best practice looks like. And we all want to grow. We're all aligned to grow, but we're very much aligned. And if a doctor doesn't want to make certain trade-offs for their patients, they don't have to. And we're okay with that. Right. So it ends up being very aligned. And that's back to that moral prerogative where I want to feel like we're doing something that's good for the industry and good for patients. And that ultimately is what's made it so much fun.
And as you as kind of founder, manager of this venture, how are you looking to get compensated, you and your partners? Yeah. I mean, how have you structured that with is there promoted interest? Is there fees? Yeah. I mean,
that's the hard part. It is not as straightforward as a regular private equity model would be, where it'd be really clear. I'd grow this for 5 to 10 years. We'll flip it. We'll make a ton of money. Yeah. This is very much around success-based because we get a percentage of those distributions. If we do our job, we pay ourselves an okay salary for now. But again, our doctors appreciate that. In fact, I make less than the vast majority of my doctors, which probably isn't fair if you look at my historical compensation and experience. But I've also been fortunate to have a couple of exits, and not that I want to make good money, but I want to do it in a way that's probably more beneficial for a broader group. And we do have a small promote in there that basically rewards us for making good investments. So if we do because we're basically investing on behalf of our dentists because they're all owners in the top co. Right. So we almost pitch it to a dentist that you're trading, a 30-year practice for ownership in 30 other practices. And they really feel that, they're very collaborative with each other because they feel like, hey, I win if you win. And so we get a small promote over time for bringing good practices and increasing that value. But ultimately it is a little weird. And my partners have a similar mentality. We're actually in this to do something good where we sort of know we're going to make half as much as we would if we'd done the normal model, but we're okay with that. Yeah. That makes sense. And I guess somewhere in there, you're sort of betting on, it's kind of like when you take a low price model versus a premium model, you're betting on volume, if that makes sense. And we sort of see this as something like I look at Ernst & Young, one of the largest accounting firms in the world, 60,000 plus employees. It's probably got 10,000 partners. Well, there's no reason we couldn't have 10,000 dental offices. Sure. Whereas, a PE model, it's like, whatever, if I get 50, I'll flip it and make some money or 100. Yeah. And so our audacious goal is frankly to be like, it'd be great if 20% of the market came this way and did it our way. Right. Because now we've preserved, if you're graduating from dental school, your option was like, I could go buy a cheap garbage practice with 3 chairs and hopefully scrap it together. And it's really hard. And it's getting harder with the private equity roll up, or I go join one of these private equity things, but I'm going to be an employee for the rest of my life. Yeah. Like there's no equity. I know what my salary is. It's not going to change a whole lot from day 1 to year 30. And instead we say, but if you come with us, you can still have practice ownership. You're going to be an owner. You're going to have the long-term benefits of equity. And in the dental profession, Utah's like the Silicon Valley of dental. I don't know if you've noticed how many dental companies there are here. A lot of that's due to our population and the religious mix here. We're overrepresented in dental schools. this ends up being a really great career where, you can work 3.5 days a week. You can make a really great income. You can be super involved in the community. And we love that model. And so our hope is also that we grow a little faster because of the beneficial economics. And if we don't, we don't. There's more than just making a big return. I feel like we also get to do something that we genuinely feel like improves the industry. We feel like if we didn't exist and we were to do the Back to the Future thing and come out in 10 years, we'd say, 80% of dentists are gone and now dental care feels like healthcare, which is not necessarily a good thing. We feel like because we exist, it could be a different future now, and there will be a different option. We've created option, C.
Right. Well, I mean, 2 years in and 30 practices later, investment in 30 practices. I mean, that's pretty incredible scale. I mean, thus far. So
it's starting to feel real, right? Yeah. Now we feel like we can start to go to other states. We can start to do something bigger. And I hope it'll be fun to see what year 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 look like. And I hope we see some really great growth there.
Yeah. I love it. Well, we'll wrap up here with a couple more questions, Mike. You mentioned investing. You Waterline, you have that. You have obviously what you're doing. But how have you thought about, you've had some liquidity now with sale, exit, IPO. How have you thought about your own personal portfolio, building wealth on the personal family front?
I met with my advisors this morning. We're doing our annual check-in. There's both the philosophical standpoint where I feel like I tell my kids 80% should be in secure things, your S&P 500, whatever, and you can be a little more risky with 10% and whatever. But I'm an entrepreneur, and so I'm definitely not adhering to those things. About half of my wealth is in very standard investment, portfolios where someone else manages, and it's sort of like the do not touch. If you just leave this alone for 40 years, it'll be big. But I can't help myself. I've probably invested in 30 different small companies of various forms, many of which I help advise in various ways. I've been involved with BYU Sandbox program. I've done a lot with a couple of different MBA programs. And then obviously Waterline and things like that. And then frankly, I've invested in myself. I put a big chunk of money into starting Accelerate. And so that there is no investor. It's if there is an investor, it's me. I'm the PE firm. It's very private equity.
Right.
But and so for me, I'd say like half of my wealth is in more private type investments. Yeah. So a good chunk obviously is my current business, but a lot is these smaller ones, and it's been fun. It's also revealing. You learn that just because you're good at one business doesn't mean you're good at a lot. You see other entrepreneurs like, that guy's going to be great. I'm going to put a bunch of money and hopefully it'll grow big, but it doesn't necessarily always work out that way, especially when it's all like I cashed out in 2021. So I feel like vintage 21 is probably not going to be our best investment vintage, but I've been fortunate. I've been involved in a couple really neat companies, and like all portfolio theory, it's okay if a few of them haven't done well because I have 10% or so that have done quite well. It's also been fun living in Utah. One of the things I've loved about being here is just how vibrant the business community is here, and things that I didn't think I'd be involved in, various real estate projects or startups or things that are doing some really amazing things. And even if the returns aren't as good, which I think they will be, it's so fun. It's fun to like drive past investments you've made and be like, okay, I invested in that, that piece of land or that resort or whatever it is. And, because Warren Buffett says you invest in stuff that right? And that part of me definitely feels like I'm there. Like I feel like, and I've only been here 4 years, but I feel like I know Utah now. Yeah. I know what's going on in St. George. I know what's going on with our ski resorts. And I know what's going on with kind of our land, economics and real estate. And so I've started doing a lot more of that stuff. And plus you start to meet other great business leaders, and everyone's a sucker for your friends because you think they're going to be so great. You're like, well, he's really great to surf with, or he's really fun to play pickleball with. Surely he's a great business manager, right? So I've done some of those things as well, and it's been fun. It's been fun.
Yeah, love it. Well, certainly a lot of opportunity here in Utah specifically.
Yeah.
Last question, Mike. I ask most of my guests this, but when you think about success across the board in life well lived, how have you defined that, and how are you trying to define success?
That's such a good one. Ultimately, I think anyone who's being honest will go straight to like family and relationships and friendships. It doesn't matter if you're the richest person in the world and you have none of those. There's no one to share the joy with. There's no one to have fun with. And so that's obviously the first guide for me. And I'm really fortunate. I've got 5 kids. I have an awesome wife. We're super happy. I think the next thing, what's driven my second mountain, as it were, is flexibility, which I don't feel today. When I started this, I originally thought I was going to be like an executive chairman. I immediately jumped into being the operator, but I have dreams of hopefully the next 5 years, pulling back a little bit, but having more flexibility, because so much of my early career, both because of the very structured approach I took and working at places like McKinsey, there was no flexibility.
Right.
So I think more flexibility is good. And, then it's just things like travel and having fun. I think it was Stuart Butterfield, the guy that founded Slack. He was on a podcast once and he said, I won't get this exactly right, but he said something like, he defined rich and wealthy as kind of a tier. And he said, you're rich when you don't pay attention anymore what it costs to go out to dinner, which I thought was a great way to define it. And he goes, you're wealthy when you don't pay attention anymore what it costs to go on a trip. And I've thought about that a lot. And I'm going to add Mike's corollary, which is, I have a couple of really fun hobbies. One of them is I love to sail. And I like to fly airplanes and I like to snowboard and I like to do whatever. So we own a sailboat in the Caribbean and we end up doing some really cool trips around the world. And so I'll be in a place like Croatia. And look, my boat is a 46-foot catamaran. It's got 4 cabins. It's a glorified motorhome. Okay,
yeah.
This is not anything that
nice.
exciting. But I've been in places like Croatia where my little boat is next to an unnamed, Russian oligarch's, mega yacht.
Yeah.
2 months ago, we were in St. Martin. My wife was doing a 50th Jubilee. She just turned 50 this year, and we had a bunch of friends, and we were in this bay. And for New Year's, I looked at that same bay like a month after we were there, and there were 188 mega yachts. So Bezos was there, Zuckerberg was there, everyone was there. And I've kind of had this realization that like the boat might be bigger, but Earth's only so big. Like I'm in the exact same place as them, And so part of it for me, if you can use that little framework, is just being content with what you have. Like, okay, do I have a 46-foot yacht or a 300-yard, whatever? Yeah, I mean, these,
right.
I think Jeff Bezos' boat is like 500 feet, mega yacht. And he has a 250-foot support yacht with him, right?
Just in case.
And, but at the end of the day, I literally am anchored in the exact same spot that he was anchored in, and I'm looking at the exact same view. I'm having the exact same experience.
Yeah.
So you might have a bigger boat or a bigger plane or a bigger house or a bigger whatever, but it's the same experience. And so that's probably tempered a lot of, you're also not an entrepreneur if you don't have a ton of ambition, and I'm cursed with too much ambition, but at some point you realize, but I'm having this great experience and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think that has definitely put things in perspective for me.
Yeah, that's great perspective. No better way to end. Thank you for sharing your story, Mike. I really, really loved getting to know you. It's exciting to see what you've done, excited to see the next steps in your journey as well, and as you continue to grow, and it's inspiring. So thank you again for sharing. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chase. It's been super fun.